our ball that we have inside of our scene. So if you haven't done these steps already, you can follow along. Otherwise, just wait. I'm going to make sure I go to my P drive, into my Maya folder, and delete the old preferences. And then go into my folder and copy the preferences and paste them back into the Maya folder. Okay, so I deleted the 2016.5 folder from Maya. I went into my folder where I copied mine and pasted them right inside there. Then I would go through and open up Maya. What we're doing, you should start collecting your textures. You should start sort of creating a library of textures that you would be able to use. And some of these you may want to use for specific things, like metal or like concrete or like wood, but you may also want to add them together to create new interesting shapes. Okay. All right, so I'm inside Maya. I'm going to go to set my project to tell Maya what I'm working on. So I go to File, Set Project. I'm working on primers. And then I go to Open, and then I find my file. Now I actually have to grab this other file because it crashed on me, and so I had to get this other wonky file. That's that. Drop that in there. And that. Oops. I don't need that one right now, though. Okay. All right. So this is where we left off last time, is that we created our concrete, our cement. Yep, that's the one we did. Okay. So we made one of these that looks like cement. If I click the render button, we should get something that looks like a ball of cement with some pits and stuff in it. Yep. All right. So on this, we did a couple things just as a recap of what we've done. This process is going to be the same every time we do a scene. So the first thing we did was we made this backdrop here. We deleted the 3 sides, and then we hit 3 on the keyboard to make it nice and round. We added in this light. We changed the intensity to like 5,000, changed it to quadratic. Under mental ray, we changed it to use light shape and high samples of 1. We then duplicated this light and scooted it over here, pulled it back a little bit. I left the intensity at 5,000, but obviously that could be adjusted too. Then we created the ball, and then we assigned a Mila to the background and just left it gray. I assigned a Mila to the ball, changed it to plastic, and then mapped this color to it and took the filter off. And then we went under the bump and we assigned a bump 2D, and then to the bump value we assigned a file which was the exact same concrete, and then turned the filter off. So that's all we've done to this. Now some other options we could play with, the bump depth. So depending on how deep or gritty this concrete is, we could increase the bump depth or decrease it. What this is doing in any kind of bump that we use, imagine that we have no bump at all, okay? So completely at 0, meaning that the picture, okay? If I took this picture and I made it black and white, the blackest values would be at 0, okay? So no bump at all. The whitest values would be at 1. So that's like the most bump, okay? So that's what this is telling us, is the bump depth is 1. The whitest values are going to be bumped out 1 unit, whatever that ends up being in Maya, okay? Now all the bump stuff is fake, so it's not actually protruding it. If I were to zoom in really close, and I rendered this from the side, and we looked at this angle right here, this angle is still going to be perfectly round because it's not actually bumping out, okay? It looks like a bump from far away, and it's a good kind of like hiding thing to make it look bumpy, but it's definitely not something that we can use for up close stuff. Even this, looking at that bump right there and this color right here, that looks pretty horrible up close. this is not meant to be an up-close texture. Because we grabbed kind of like the first or second of the concretes, there's not a lot of resolution here. So we may need to adjust some of our stuff on that, okay? But from far away, it looks pretty decent. From far away, this concrete actually looks like it could be a ball of some sort of concrete. All right, actually it looks like it has some bump and some depth to it. Even if we looked at the edges here, this looks like it's bumpy, but it's not. It's just the look of it. Okay. So anytime we have a bump file, what this is doing is it's reading this information in a black and white format and converting it into something that makes sense for Maya. So in these darker areas here, let me go view this image. Concrete Bear 323.4. Because I want you to see what this is doing, because it's very important, because as we get further on in the class, we're going to need to create our own bump maps. Okay? Our own maps that tell us where things are bumpy and where things are not bumpy. And some things like metal, you may have a piece of metal that's, let's say it has red paint on it. Well, that red paint might bump up like this. We don't want it to bump up like that. We just want it to be just like a little indicator on it. Okay? Or we might have wood, and the wood has different variations in tone, and the wood variations are making it look really bumpy. All right, so I'm going to open up that file in Photoshop just so you can see what the bump map is actually doing. Concrete 323. Textures calm. Come on. All right, so what Maya is doing with this is it converts it to a black and white image. So if I just take the saturation off, that's how Maya is reading it, okay? So anything that is black like this, there's no bump. Anything that's white is bumped out the most, and anything that's in between is in between, okay? So if I were to just put a levels on this, you can see that there's no actual like true black values in here, okay? You see there's no white right in this area. That means that there is no black. And the same thing on the far right side, there is no pure white. All right, so it's not even reading anything pure white or pure black. Everything is in the middle. If I were to go like this and go like that, okay, what I've essentially done is eliminated a lot of the midtones. Okay, a lot of those gray values where it was like in between are now gone. So I basically have stuff that is very black, very white, and very little actual gray. So if I were to use this image inside of Maya as my bump, what would happen is instead of it looking like it's bumpy all over, it would look pretty smooth for the most part, and then certain areas would be bumpy. Okay? So just to show you, let me just save this as. Just save it as test bump. And then we'll just reload it as test bump. Okay. Now without even rendering it, you can see what this looks like. You can see how it looks like it's pretty smooth in many spots, but then everywhere we get those black spots, we're getting a bump. Okay.
It makes me think of actual concrete. Just the way it looks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here you can definitely see it. If we look here, you can see there's definitely some spotting there. Now it looks like they're bumping in, okay, but what's actually happening is the black is causing it not to move, and all the white is being pulled out. If I jump back to Photoshop and I just invert this, so now the black is the dominant color. And then I go through and I reload that image. There we go. We'll save this one. We'll re-render it again. So now if we look down here, you can see that now it looks like those pieces are actually bumping out this way instead of being pushed in. And if we look at the before and after, you can definitely see a difference in what those two things are. Okay? Now with that being said, this bump 2D allows us to tweak it without having to go into Photoshop. Okay? So if we wanted more bump or less bump, we can just go to that bump 2D or that bump depth and change the depth of it. All right, so let me switch this back to, oops, stay in Maya. Let me switch this file back to the original file it was, which was that one. Okay, and we should be back to where we were before. All right, so right now we have basically a bump all over. If I want to lessen the overall bump, I could just go to this bump depth and knock that down. So if I make this 0.1, that bump depth will take that bump that's going out to here and it'll diminish it. Come on. Okay. So now the overall bump is definitely a lot less than it was before. I could also take that bump 2D and make it negative. If I make it negative, then it's going to automatically switch the colors. So black will be white and white will be black, basically. Okay? Now in this case, we're not seeing a whole lot of difference. Because I'm still using my original image, this one here, it has a lot of different in-between values. I didn't eliminate any values by shrinking that thing. So if I needed something like this where I'm eliminating a lot of the gray values, I need to go into Photoshop and tweak it. If I'm simply just lessening or greatening the value, I can do that right inside of Maya. Okay? So just be aware that sometimes we need to adjust it. It's not simply a matter of just dropping it on, and because we've used the same file, everything will be happy. It's not going to. We need to tweak pretty much everything. Okay? I'm just going to set that back to 1, actually 0.5, 0.25. There we go. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to assign a new Mila to our sphere. And we'll assign a metal material to it. So I'm going to rename it to be Metal Mila. And then to the diffuse, I'm going to map a file. And that's just going to be one of my metal files that I found. Fine. So with the shininess of this, I'm going to go back to the same spot I did on the concrete and change my base component to, instead of diffuse, I'm going to change it to reflective and isotropic. And then render it again.
For the most part.
Kind of looks appropriate. What does look nice on this though is that we are getting kind of this not perfect pattern where we're getting some little scuffs there. This metal though, the metal that I chose anyway, it looks pretty rough. Like obviously metal could be a range of things. You know, if we had a piece of metal, it could be discolored in these black spots, it could be discolored in the yellow spots and the gray spots. We can give a little bit more life to this though. Maybe this is kind of like some sort of calcification or rust or something that's actually starting to grow on it. So if I came down to where the bump is, the overall bump, and I did the same trick, right? I click on the bump map thing. I go to my utilities and add a bump 2D. I click on the bump value and go to file, and then I grab that same file. Make sure all my filter types are set to off on those files too. So like on some of these, if you didn't connect the bump correctly, like this down here, where you connected it to the bump 2D and then connect the file, it won't bump, okay? Or if you don't have the right specularity, the right setting there, it won't shine, Okay, so being able to isolate what's happening and then figuring out how to correct it is part of that key. Now with anisotropic, one of the things that it allows us to do is adjust what the specularity is doing. Okay, instead of us getting like on the previous one, I don't think I saved it. No. On the previous one, we had just basically like a big highlight where our light was shining. So we basically had like a circle, okay? With anisotropic, if I open up these settings here, which it just created, I can adjust this amount, okay? Now it's going to be hard for us to tell what it's doing because the bump is right now so strong, okay? So I'm going to first go down to where my bump is and click the little arrow, and then just take my bump depth down to like 0.1. Okay, then I can click back on the ball, and now I can see what that anisotropy is doing. So looking at the default value, I think was 1. Yeah. Looking at the default value of 1, do you see how in the center of my sample there, the highlight is just a circle? As I take this up to like 20, it spreads it out. So it's making it thinner, but then stretching it out vertically. So that only happens when I've chosen anisotropic. If I chose plastic again, I don't get any of those options. Okay? So for an item like metal, I may not want my reflection or my specular to be perfectly round. I may want to stretch it out. Let me show you this example here. All right, so something like this, where it's brushed metal, this may need to have something more than just a big specular highlight on here because it may not look correct. I may need to adjust it. Okay, something like this one may be okay using it. Now that I'm looking at this one a little bit different, it looks like there's even water on this right down here. That could be an issue later on. Okay, so sometimes you want to adjust these kinds of things. So we clicked the sphere, we made it a Mila, we mapped the file to the color, we changed this to anisotropic right there. We mapped the bump 2D here. I just kind of nudged that down a little bit. And then I can adjust this anisotropic to like 10 or so. And then just to see the difference in what before and after looks like, there you go. So I took the bump down and then adjusted that anisotropy. I think I could probably go a little bit more, like maybe 30. Yeah, it's not doing a whole lot on this one. Now I could also adjust the amount of glossiness. Last time we talked about that. Glossiness blend is the amount of reflection. So the more glossy blend there is, the more reflection we're going to get. The rougher that is, the more diffuse that's going to be. So by pulling this glossy roughness up to 1 and then rendering it out, we're going to get something that's very diffuse with our specular. Okay, we take it back the other way, glossy roughness is off, and then we're going to get something that's very sharp, okay, with our specular. So all the time we're looking at everything in our scene to see how all of these attributes are playing together. So with this one, with this glossy roughness down, I'm getting this big black triangle in the center of this. This here and that there, those are my two lights in my scene. Those are reflecting in there. The only reason that this is distorted like this is because of my bump. Okay? Watch how I can take my bump down to 0. We'll render it again. And those items should be a lot crisper because we don't have a bump on there anymore. And my metal now doesn't look like metal because it doesn't have that bump on there. So you have to be aware of all these settings because That's what's going to help make your item look more realistic. Being able to go in there and say, you know what, this is a metal. It's pretty smooth all over, but I still want to add a little bit of bump to this because I want to make sure that that metal reads correctly. So by just adding that to 0.125, it adds a lot more detail to this surface. By taking my glossy roughness up a bit, it adds a bit more detail again to that surface. So something like my brush metal here, if I had this piece of metal physically in front of me and I'm standing in front of it and I'm looking at it, I don't think I would see my reflection in this, okay? So that tells me that that glossiness, that specularity is really rough, right? It's really diffuse. Whereas if I'm looking at something like, well, they're all rough. I didn't pick anything good. Shiny metal. Okay, where if I'm looking at something like this, I think I would at least see part of my reflection in there, even though it might be a little bit, you know, hazy. If I'm looking at a mirror, which is the ultimate reflection, or chrome, oh, Bing, you're killing me today. Ah. Oh, man. There we go. So if I'm looking at something that's chrome, I'm definitely going to expect my reflection to be super crisp and sharp and very obviously reliant on that. Okay? So when I look at something like this and I have this material here, I'm analyzing what that material should look like based on the picture I've grabbed. It looks like the specular is flooded out. It looks like it's spread out here, very rough. So I want to relay that information into the settings that I have here. Pulling the roughness up. It's probably not as reflective. Pull that down. The anisotropy, for this case, I'm not really seeing a huge difference in this, so I would just leave it at 1. Sure, that's good enough. And then for the bump, this is where the bump, editing the bump map inside of Photoshop helps, because I don't want the overall thing to be as bumpy as it is. Like, it looks chunky, right? It looks like it's like blobby in some areas, and that looks really fake. So for something like this, I think I'd want to go into Photoshop, that's my image, and I would want to edit this. There's other ways to edit it besides just grabbing the levels and squeezing things in there. Maybe I just want to pull out some certain areas, okay? Looking at the yellow, looking at the gray here, these kinds of colors, that could be just discoloration, okay? If it's something that's discoloring the current material, there wouldn't be an actual bump. If I took this thing here, okay, and you can see, kind of, let me turn the light on. You can kind of see that there's a little bump detail inside here, right? You can see a little bit of vein work. If I took a marker and I went like this, that vein work would still be there, okay? That wouldn't change what that is. But if I took a piece of Play-Doh and I stuck it on here, or if I gouged it, that would change the bump. That would change what's happening to it. If I wrote graffiti on a wall, that doesn't change the wall. It doesn't bump out that much. Graffiti paint is like minusculely thin. The bumps that are here already would still be here. It would just be adding to it. So something like the discoloration of this metal, that may have very little effect on the actual like height, the actual bump of it. But these black areas, these might actually be like stains, some sort of metal corrosion happening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate these areas a little bit more. So I'm going to go to select and use color range, and I'm going to pick up on the black. And you'll see when I use that, it picks up on the black all over this thing. Then I can use my fuzziness slider, to control how much of that darkness is being pulled out. So maybe like that. Okay, so now I've isolated just those black areas. So then I'm just going to make a new layer. I'm going to fill the new layer with black. I'm going to make another new layer, put it underneath, and fill that with white. Okay, so now this is my new bump map, where I have complete white here, super smooth, and then in these areas I'm looking at something that is bumpy. Okay, and because of how we did this, you'll see that we even have, come on, zoom back. We even have areas of gray around this. Okay, if I would have gone through, just so you can see it, and I just did this, like that, and like this, you know, all the playing in the world isn't going to give me results that are like the other ones. Now if I look at this, I have areas of yellow, and then there's these very hard areas around it. Okay, so doing the color range is definitely a good way to grab some of the stuff. So metal, bear, bump. And say it as a Targa. So now I'm going to change this, and then we'll see how this is going to change the look of this. Okay, so there's what it would look like before. We'll render it again. We should have a pretty smooth area. And then we have these black areas where that specular really isn't going into it. Okay? So you can see, here's that specular. Before, it was going into those dark areas. Okay? That bump was pretty much all over. And so you can see how it was getting into that. Okay? Now it looks like we definitely have a smoothness here where that's not getting in. Now it also looks like these black areas are pits. Based on how this looks, and just sometimes it's hard to see when you just look at a single image. But as I go back and forth, you can see it looks like it's pitted inward. So that's where I would go back to my bump and make this negative. I would make it a little bit more negative. There we go. So looking at these, you can definitely tell it looks like it's kind of more outward than it was before, and I think that's probably too much now. It still might be a little bit too much. There we go. So that should be good enough. Okay. So I've taken that base metal and just tweaked the file on it just so that we would get something that is more isolated to it. So what I want you to do is I want you to go into Photoshop with your metal, and you may want to pick a different metal that, you know, if you don't have enough detail in it. If you chose something that is like this, it's pretty boring. You can still pull things out like the whites. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult to do. When you have something like this one, it's a little bit more obvious because of the stuff that was there. So go into Photoshop, use your color range, and isolate the white areas and the black areas. Okay, and then save it out and put it on as a bump. All right, now just to show you the steps inside of Photoshop again, because this process isn't going to be one that we use one time and we're done with it. It's going to be something that we may want to tweak throughout. Every assignment, every material that we play with, we may want to adjust it. So let me grab this one. There we go. So here's a good example too. You'll see on this one that there's like bolts on here in the corners. We have some paint that's peeling right here. And what else do we have? You know, some scuff right there. You can actually see the indentation here and some of that. Now what would happen, we took this image, let's say, and we used this on a wall. Okay, so we just take this image, we drop it on a wall. If we're not doing anything else except for using this as a faraway wall, it's no big deal. But if we were to use this as a texture that we got close to, and someone was able to see that there's bolts on here that have shadows, and our lighting doesn't match the lighting of the original picture, it might look weird. Okay, so let's take this one here. This is metal base 1802. So I'm going to put this on the Y drive. Okay, I want you to grab this texture off of the Y drive in from the 2520 textures. Okay, and I want you to put that into your folder. And we're going to edit this one together just so you can see what would go into prepping a texture for use inside of your stuff. Okay, so copy it, put it into your 2520 folder.
Which one was that?
It was the M Metal Base 1082M. It's the one that has like the orangey on it. Alright, so our first step in looking at this kind of texture is looking at our uses for it. So let's pretend that we wanted to use this texture for something that we were going to get relatively close to. Okay? So one of the things we need to do is eliminate anything that is extruding from the surface, because that's like a dead giveaway that it's flat. If we have bolts on there, and let's say we're doing a video game, our character walks up to the video game wall and there's bolts in the texture, but there's not actually bolts extruding from it, that could be like a why is there those things there. Now on the other hand, if this is something where it's further away and we're using this a lot, we may not want to have bolt geometry all over the place, so it may be cool to use that. In this case, we want to eliminate these kinds of things. So Photoshop CC 2015, whatever version we're on, has some pretty neat tools that we can use. One of them is the clone stamp, which I'm sure you've seen before. There's also spot healing, healing brushes, patch tools, all of these. The spot healing brush is pretty neat, where you literally just go over what you don't want, and then you let go, and it just erases it. Okay, so you can see how very quickly I can get rid of these bolts just by using the spot healing brush to get rid of it. So I'm just going to go around the entire image using that spot healing brush, and anything that I see is something that I want to get rid of. I think everything else should be good. There's a couple little things sticking off the edge here. Just want to clean that up. Okay. A couple other ones that might be helpful is the healing brush, where in this one we're actually defining an area, so I would hold Alt and I would click, and then I could basically say I want to cover this up with that, and it covers it up with that. Okay, so I don't need to do that. Also, the patch tool is pretty neat, where you just draw a shape around things. So like, let's say I wanted to get rid of this, and then I drag this to that area, and what it does is it uses this area to fill in that area. Okay, so sometimes some of these tools, like the patch tool and these automatic content aware things, don't always do a great job, and so they have these other tools. And if all else fails, you can jump to the clone stamp and just do it manually. Just airbrushing it out manually. Okay, so does everyone have all the bolts removed? Yes? No? Maybe? Yes? No? Thank you. Okay, so now that those are removed, now we have to create our bump map that we would use for this. Okay, so I don't like to destroy anything that I'm using in my image. Okay, we destroyed those things, but that's fine because we're not going to use them again. But from here on out, I'm not going to destroy anything. So if I make something, it's going to be on a new layer. Now, looking at our previous one, where we isolated those areas we wanted to use as a bump area, this one's going to be very similar. Look at how on here, where it's dark, it's basically like there's rust underneath and there's paint, and the paint is kind of like peeling off of it. So if I take this dark area here and I make that my black area and I make this bumpy area white, that should look like it's kind of pulled off a little bit. Now this being, I mean, it's minuscule. It's being pulled off like that much. So it's nothing crazy. So it's going to work. If this was something like, that's a good example of it. If it was something like this, there's no way this technique would work. This kind of stuff here would be actual geometry. This kind of stuff we can get away with being a texture, okay, with a really good bump. This one here, you know, it's kind of 50-50, all right? So that's what we're dealing with, is this one that could work as this. Now if I look on this side, this area here, I probably don't want that area to bump as much as I want the other area to bump, because these look like they're pretty smooth together. Okay, do you see how this looks like it's just the metal's discolored, not really rusty? Whereas here, this has actually been lifted off the surface. Okay, so using that same technique, I'm going to go to Select Color Range, and I'm going to pick on the darkest area here. And I may have to zoom in to grab it, and then use my selection tool to pull this up. Now you could also use these. This first one here is basically, here's my main color, and then these two are just adding to the color or taking away from the color. Now for this, it doesn't matter. We're just going to use the one with the slider. So I'm pulling it up as much as I need to. I think 186 is a good value here. And then I hit OK. Okay, so I clicked on that dark area, cranked it up to about 186, and now I can look at my selection to see what I have. And I want to analyze this. I don't want to just assume that it's correct. I want to actually look at what it's selecting and verify that that's what I want. Okay? Now, do I have everything that I want? No, I do have everything I want, but I have more. Okay? I don't want this stuff over here. All right? Now I could go in and deselect all that stuff, but it's easier just to paint it out. Okay? So we're going to make 2 layers. So just so you can see this, I'm going to bring my layers up here and make 2 layers. The top layer is going to be our black. So I'm just going to go on my layer 2, and this is the easy way just so you visually see it. Edit Fill, and choose black. Okay, so I just went to Edit, Fill, chose black from there, and it filled it with black. Then I'm going to deselect. So I can go to Control D, select deselect, go to layer 1 and fill that with white. Okay, so now we have, like we said, too much coloration on here. We don't want to have all of this. If we were to take this into Maya, all of these spots here, which look like in this they're actually pretty smooth, they would actually come out bumpy. Like our metal looks like it should be pretty smooth overall. I mean, there are some like streaks right here probably and some other stuff, you know, but for the most part, side to side we shouldn't have all of that bumpiness. Okay, so what we want to do is go to layer 2, make sure nothing is selected, so we can go to select, deselect just to verify, and then we're going to click on this layer mask. Okay, now the layer mask will allow us to delete, basically erasing some of these parts and then keeping some of these parts. So using my regular brush, so I just hit B, I'm going to paint with black in areas I want to get rid of. Okay, so right now I'm on my brush. I have black selected as my painting color. I'm just going to go through and just paint some of these areas I don't want. Now the brush that I have, before you get too far ahead, the brush that I have is way too soft, so if I get anywhere near this, an area I want to keep, it's just going to feather it, and that's going to look ugly. So I also want to make sure that I've chosen a brush that has some sort of character to it. So these ones here are pretty decent. Just these like patterny kind of brushes.
Do it matter which one we pick?
No. You ideally just want to find something that's going to leave a little bit of texture there, so that as you're erasing stuff, it doesn't leave just like a soft area. You know, maybe you have a little bit of a bump there or something. So what I'm doing is I'm going through and just erasing out a lot of this. Now if I run across an area that's very dark, like you can see this really dark hole here, right there, I'm just going to leave the dark hole. Okay, because all these dark spots are probably like little pits or something that are actually in the texture. So I'm going to leave that as best I can and just go through and clean this up. And make your brush bigger, smaller, whatever you need to get the job done. And this is where, like I said before, tablets would come in handy because we can just paint with a tablet. Well, we're not going to spend too much time on this one.
So you just really want us to get rid of all the gray areas?
Not the gray areas, just the stuff on the sides. Where it should be smooth, where we shouldn't really have a whole lot of bumps. And I'm leaving a couple pits in there because there is a couple pits. But there's not as much bump as it was showing. Like all of this stuff, we brought it in, all that would be bumpy. And it doesn't look like that on the picture. So I just want to eliminate all that. And feel free to switch back and forth between the actual picture and the bump map and see what is actually needing to be bumped. Because some of these black areas I'm looking at closer don't need to actually be bumped. They don't need to be there. And if you have some intermittent gray areas, don't worry about those. We'll eliminate those in a minute. All right, so when you're done, it should go from something like this, where we have all these dark areas around the edges, to something like that. Now I did leave this spot up here, because if I look at the original image, it definitely looks like it's kind of cracked out of that. Okay, I'll blend this in a little bit nicer there. There we go. And same thing here, that's existing in that image. And even in the middle, if I see an area where it just looks a little bit too streaky or a lot of just detail area doesn't need to be there, I'm just eliminating that. All right, so for the most part, we have this cleaned up. We can always come back and do more to it if we need to. So now one of the things I need to correct are all these little areas here where we have some gray. I could go into this and paint all these areas out, but I'm trying to figure out a quick way to go from here's my image to here's my bump map or my whatever map that I need. So if I do something like this, where I have pretty good contrast, and in most of these, that's what we're looking for is contrast. Here's my whitest value, there's my darkest value. If I can find a way to eliminate all the in-betweens that I don't need, all the better. So if I go down here to where we have our adjustment layers, the little half circle, and I add a curves to this, the curves allows me to do that, okay? So if you're not comfortable with curves, maybe this will help. So this down here is our darkest black value. Way up at the top is our farthest white value. So if I take my black value here and I pull this down, what this does is it darkens all my dark values. Okay, so anything that's already black or in the black range, it keeps it black. Anything that's white, it's going to keep it white. Now watch as I drag this over. Do you see how everything now that's at a medium gray, or was at a medium gray, is now white? Because everything that I'm doing with this single point, everything from here over has now become white. Okay? So that's all I'm doing, is I'm keeping my blacks black like this, and I'm dragging the white dot over to keep more of that in there. And the further I go, the more I'll keep those values. So this way I can kind of really play with, watch these here, I can really play with how much of this I want to show through. So maybe something like that is a pretty good deal. Maybe I can pull the black a little bit too. There we go, something like that. Like that. Okay. So add a curves and get your curve to do the same thing that mine did. Even though we're kind of taking this a bit slower the first time, people that are texture artists, this is what they do. They go out and they grab images. They'll take pictures of walls, they'll take pictures of grass, they'll take pictures of metal and wood and everything, bring them back to the shop, they clean them up, remove the bolts, remove whatever they need to, and then they'll start making, here's a bump map for it, here's a reflection map, here's this map, here's that map. And then they'll just create basically a library of all these different things. So even though you may not ever use this specific texture that's here, or any other texture that you may download, it's a good habit to get into to start downloading some of these, analyzing what's going on in the image, and trying to figure out the best way to capture that for your texture. Okay? All right, so now we're going to save this twice. Once, we're going to save this as metal, oops, whatever the name was, as a PSD. Okay? So whatever the name is, I save it as a PSD. That way I know this is the file that goes with that one. Then the other time we save it, we're going to save it as a TGA, a Targa, and it's going to be the bump. So I just put an underscore bump at the end of it. Okay, so one we saved just as a PSD. The next one we save with an underscore bump after the end of it. And then we're going to save it one more time with just the color. So I turn off the other layers, put an underscore color after it, and save that as a TGA. I turned off these three and then saved it as a TGA also. Hit OK. And then once you're done, go into Maya and test it out.
So you take them all off except for the background instead.
All right, let's also look at one more aspect of this. So what does glossy blend mean?
Isn't that how sharp that is?
How much reflection it is. Okay, so glossy blend is controlling how much reflectivity we're getting on this object. Glossy roughness is controlling how sharp it is. Okay, so if we looked at the picture here, how much reflection do you think is in an area like this? Well, something, maybe like 0.2. Like everything typically has some sort of reflection on it or some sort of specularity. So maybe like 0.2 in these areas. What do you think the rust is reflecting? Pretty much nothing, right? So if we look at our map here that we created, we pretty much have that. We pretty much have this map that allows us to say that we have a certain reflection here and another reflection here. Okay? So Maya will actually read these values as 100% reflection, 0% reflection. Okay? Now, if we need to adjust that, we can. Now, this curves layer here, this actually works out pretty good because we may also want to give our surface a little bit more appeal to it by not having it uniformly reflective across the entire thing, because that's not likely. Unless we had something like chrome or a car or something where we wouldn't see it, where we would see more of a uniform reflection. So I'm going to turn my curves off, and I'm going to turn on my exposure. So I'm going to make a new one. And what I want to do is pull this down. Okay, so something like that I think should be good. Maybe a little bit less. I go lower than that. Negative 0.75. Nope. Fine. I will add another exposure. I will offset you even further. There you go. So I added 2 exposures just to get this down. I wanted this color here to be at about 2.2-ish, okay? So I added 1 exposure and took the offset to -5. So that takes everything as far as the color goes and drops it down to, as far as the white goes, to 0.5. Then I added another exposure and dropped it down to -0.25, and that lowered it even further, okay? So just so you can see what I'm trying to do is this here, if you look at this number, that doesn't give you a good value. 40%. Yeah, I guess they can use that. This value here, the CMYK, if you look at it, it's about 40%. So that gives us about where we're going to need to be for that one. Okay? So I'm going to save this as reflection TGA. So I turned my curves off. I turned 2 exposures on and just dropped 1 exposure to -0.5 offset and 1 to -0.24. And I'll map that onto my glossy blend.
Does it leave both of the exposures on in background? You said that?
What was that?
You said cut the 2 off and leave that in?
No, leave both exposures on.
Okay.
What's the other one? -5.
-5 and then -0.25. I'm going to try something different. I didn't. We can also use levels. I forgot about that one. If you just throw levels on there, that one's easier to use. Just crank the white intensity down. There we go. It made it a little bit brighter than I was expecting it to make. Glossy blend, yes. Reload. Off.
Are we able to change the glossiness and stuff inside of Maya itself?
Yes, we can still tweak it. I have to just do it on the file. Color balance. There we go. All right, it came in with the, let me see, are they reading the alpha channel somehow? Does this have an alpha? Mask. It was coming in crazy bright. Like if you look at how it came in by default, it came in obviously super bright. So it's reading these values of 0.2 as 1. That's why it's coming in like that, okay? So on this glossy blend, there's a arrow we can click to get to the file. And if we scroll down to where it says color balance, we can change this alpha gain. So we change that to 0.1 or 0.2, maybe even 0.15. What that will do is then take us into that range that's where we want it to be. Okay? We can always come back to that alpha gain and up it to maybe 0.25 to increase some of that. Now what this is going to give us, apart from the other one, is just more control over that glossiness. Now it's going to be a little bit tricky to see. Let me make it more apparent. Actually, I'll sharpen it up. That's what I'll do. So what we're getting here is less reflection in some of these areas. So like right here, where these little pits are, there's no reflection at all happening inside there, which is what we want. We don't want any reflection or real specularity inside it. Because what that could do is it could take this rust, which is supposed to look like it's basically, you know, dead metal. It could make it a little bit too shiny, and now it's not looking so dirty. This is after doing some, you know, some tweaking to this, right? Like we adjusted the reflection, we adjusted the bump, we adjusted the color, we adjusted all of these properties. This is my metal Mila. What I'm going to do is just assign, you're not going to do this part, just so you can see it. I'm just going to assign a new Mila to this and just drop on that same file. And color. So there's my current one. I'm going to save it. I'm going to render it again. And we'll see what the difference is, and we'll see if it was worth it. Okay, here's the one with just the color on here. There's ours. So you can tell that that one definitely has a lot more life in it after we've done some tweaking and adjustments, and the time we spent making those textures look the way they look is definitely well going to be worth it. Your model is only going to be able to get you so far. The rest of it has to come from the texture, okay? So in some cases where we wouldn't be modeling these little cut lines here, we have them because they're in the texture, okay? So your texture is vitally important to make sure you're getting it to read. I mean, look at the flatness of that and just how much more this surface actually looks like it has some detail just based on the stuff that we've done to it. Okay, so any texture you use, you really want to go through this process of taking it into Photoshop and tweaking it. Any one of these things that's in here, like even this kind of thing, you can't rely on this just to be your only source of where the bumps are coming from. Because if you look close to this right here is your, I'm going to say not your brightest spot, but it's definitely kind of like a mid-range. This is a mid-range. This little sliver is pretty bright, and the shadow is dark. So imagine what would happen if I just dropped this file in as the bump. It's not going to work. It's not going to look right. The highlight's going to come up. The bump spot's going to stay down, and those mid areas are going to be kind of at the same level. Okay, what is this one? Metal Floor Bare 31. All right. So just for fun, let's just take this and put Metal Floor Bare 31 in here. Metal Floor Bare 31. Okay, and then we'll go to the bump map. I'll turn both of those off. And you can see it definitely looks funky, right? It definitely looks like the bumps are hitting in weird spots. It just doesn't look right at all. Okay, so something like this you definitely want to process. The other thing we have to consider too is our light from top to bottom, from left to right. So if you look at the coloration up here and you look at the color down there, there might be a subtle difference inside here. And if we decided to tile this texture, that could cause some issues. Let me bring up another texture here that has it a little bit more apparent. Okay, so something like this, look how bright it is up here, look how dark it is down there. If I were to tile this, meaning that I'm like repeating that same texture over and over, we would definitely see those dark and light spots kind of bumping into each other. Yes, ma'am.
So if you have to like UV map these textures,
Mm-hmm.
do like the bump maps UV map those too?
When you UV map, you're UV mapping for the entire thing. Whatever you drop on it will be perfect.
Okay.
Okay, as long as your UVs are perfect. So now other stuff that we could play with inside of Photoshop is under the filter other is an offset. And what this allows us to do is take this picture and literally offset it and loop it around. So if I want to see what this end and this end look like when they're butted up against each other, I can just use this offset and slide them right next to each other. So then I can see there's a definite difference between these two colors. And what's neat about this is that I could then use my rubber stamp and I could clone out that difference. I think I need to take my flow down a little bit. Yeah, a lot of bit, too much. There we go. And then I also have to look for repeats, like this thing is repeating itself, so I gotta eliminate that. Okay, so now when these two ends butt up against each other, they're not gonna look exactly the same, or exactly different. They're gonna actually blend together pretty nicely. Also look down here. See that little line? That has to be corrected also. So maybe I just brush this end here. Or maybe why even have it there? I'm not even sure what that line's for. Why not just eliminate that line? Why not just go through like this and just crop it just to get rid of that line? Now if I offset it one direction, I have to offset it in the other direction too. So I'm going to just offset it vertically. Alright, there's still a line there. I'm going to go with my clone stamp. I could try the healing brush, but I think that that's too much of an area for it to even consider healing. Didn't do too bad of a job. Alright. So that looks like it's pretty well blended together. So this is now a texture that I could use and repeat over and over and over again, and we would see minimal patterns in there. Okay, if you repeat something enough times, you're definitely going to see a pattern. But with this, it should be, relatively decent. Okay. So we have to be aware of that. So as you use a texture, look at all the stuff that's there. Now here's something with the metal floor. That metal floor image that I had right here, when I downloaded it, I actually got two things. One of them is this, the other one is this, okay? Now this is a bump map of that. Now I don't believe this one would actually work correctly, but if you look at this being a blue color, it's more than just a bump map, it's actually called a normal map. And the normal map is going to read the actual surface direction of what each one is, okay? This one wouldn't work though because it's not set up right. Do I have any more normal maps? Not there. Yes, sir.
Do you apply normal map the same way you apply bump map?
Yes. Here you go. This is a good example of a normal map, okay? So you see here, in this case, it's actually showing you the X, Y, and Z information pretty much for all those rocks. And all of these areas, you can tell the rock is bumped out, and then these little areas here where the rocks are kind of like, that's the cement holding all the rocks together, okay? Or something like that. It looks like all of those areas are matching up good, okay? So you can use normal maps, and they're in many cases better for you than a bump, because a bump is simply a black and white, here it is, here it isn't. Even something like this, just for fun. Save this. Everything I use, make sure it goes into your source images. Source images.
Oh, were we supposed to respond to that?
No. All right. For just for a second, I'm just going to hide that, and I'm just going to make a cylinder. Where'd it go? There it is. Pull it up. And normal maps are what they use for video games. So video games don't have like a bump map while you're working in them. What they have is a normal map, and that gives you a better representation of the stuff that's in there. So I'm going to assign a Mila to this. Mila. And to the bump map, I'm going to go to a utilities, bump 2D. Here's where I would tell it to be a tangent space normal, and then go to the bump value. So that's the only difference, is that we would choose to tell it that it is a tangent. And 10 pence. There we go. All right, now here, the UVs for this one aren't laid out correctly. The cylinder comes up with, it's way up here on the top. So I need to grab that face, go to the planar map. We'll get more into this as we get further in the class. And there we go. Okay, so now this is just a UV map. That's all, or a normal map. That's all that is. But as I start to move my lighting around, just moving that over there, you can see how this is updating and kind of corresponding correctly with the lighting. You can see how it looks a little bit darker here and lighter on this side. So it's actually registering my lights a little bit better than the other stuff would. Okay, better than a typical bump map would. Let me add a point light here. It might be a little bit easier to see. There we go. So even though this is just a flat picture, because I'm using a normal map, this actually is reading as having some sort of bump to it. Okay, when we get into programs like ZBrush, we can actually generate normal maps that we can then use inside of Maya. I'm just going to assign my existing metal Mila on here. All right. Okay. So we'll definitely get into using normal maps and stuff like that. But the point is, you want to tweak your textures. You can't leave them as default. You can't just grab a texture, drop it in, and call it being done. You have to tweak these things to get them to read correctly. If you look at any of the stuff, shader network. Any textures that anyone uses for something that's either commercial or for a movie or just really cool stuff, one of the things they're doing is obviously adjusting your texture, but then also having enough information being pumped into it that it can control the look of it much better. Inside of Maya right now, we're only dealing with a couple things. We're only dealing with the color, the glossy blend, and the bump. There's a lot of other areas we could also go in and tweak some of these things to get different results. There we go. So here is, let me see if I can find a good one. There you go, that's a good one. So here is something that is common when you have a texture shader network. It is something like this, where you have all of these things kind of piped into this same area to create that one texture that looks super awesome, okay? And our texture is, it's got a couple things to it, but it's nowhere near as complex. There's a bunch of utilities and stuff inside of Maya. Let's go there. Down here under utilities that we could use. So some of these are things like, where is it at? Blending colors, we could use something like that on here. We could use, they've added stuff since. Multiply, divide for some of our stuff. We could use these switches for some of our stuff. We could remap colors, remap HSVs. We can reverse things. There's a bunch of different things we can do in here to kind of use this texture or create it as something that we could use across multiple surfaces. Imagine we had several of these balls. It's pretty obvious it's CGI if every single one of these looks exactly the same, right? We want to have something in here where we could vary the color or vary the hue or the saturation value or vary just the placement of some of these things. So in some instances, what we're going to do is that we're going to create more advanced shading networks. In some instances, what we're going to do is take this kind of setup and just duplicate it and have multiple textures for things, okay? Or multiple setups that we can duplicate. So if I duplicated this whole setup, it's simply a matter of changing these files out, and then I would have a brand new texture, right? Go into Photoshop, get a different metal, and then I would have something else that looks completely different. Okay? And then in some instances, we can have this same metal all piped into this, but using the UV texture editor, we can offset certain things. Okay? So there's lots of different things that we can do with our texture. The first step is just these basics. So make sure that you are understanding how we went into Photoshop, how we cleaned up the image and got rid of the bolts, how we adjusted our color if need be, how we painted the blacks and the whites and adjusted it. I don't need to save that. And then how we brought that back into Maya and applied it to just these three pieces here, okay? Because these things could be for anything. Anything at all that we want to isolate, we could do that for. In some cases, we may want to use transmissive. I'm going to assign this to a different one. Assign new material. Not transmissive, sorry. Diffuse. There we go. And where was that one at? Oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong one. I would use Mila or Mia. There we go. And in this case, I may build a separate material just for this additional color here. Photoshop. Where's my PSD? There we go. Okay, so let's say, just for the fun of it, let's say in these dark areas, I wanted them to glow. For whatever reason, I wanted them to glow. Okay, so I can add an invert in here. There we go. And then I could add a levels. Perfect. And I'm going to save this as metal, blah, 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 glow, TGA. Cool. And then on here, if I map that metal glow to this, when I render this item, what should happen is it should be pretty black, and then we get these white areas. Now I have to turn everything else off, which I didn't do yet. There's no color. Diffuse, black. No. Reflection, black. No. No. Okay, so now this is completely black, and then we have these white areas. So I could use that information to then bring that into After Effects or Photoshop or whatever and have these certain areas glow. In this case, it really doesn't apply, but let's say I had a sign and I wanted words to glow that were on the sign. Or I had a TV and I wanted the TV to glow, or whatever it is. Okay? So using these maps smartly by creating them inside of Photoshop and then bringing them into Maya is the key. That's the workflow that we're trying to get through. Okay? So make sure you're understanding all of that stuff. The lecture that I just did is